Welcome to Minority Trip Report. MTR is a podcast spotlighting stories of personal transformation and underrepresented leaders in mental health, psychedelics, and consciousness. I'm your host, Raad Seraj. If you're learning from or enjoying Minority Trip Report, please subscribe to MTR on YouTube at Minority Trip Report and follow us on Instagram at Minority Trip. Thank you and enjoy the episode. Today, my guest is Danish Anwar, who is an award-winning comedian and trend-setting producer known for selling out shows worldwide, from iconic venues like the Comedy Store in LA and the National Arts Center in Ottawa to the ultra-cool Tokyo Comedy Bar in Japan, where he has become a recurring favorite. He has worked with comedy titans like David Attal, Russell Peters, and Paul Provenza, performed at prestigious festivals like Just for Laughs, ZooFest, and Magler's International Comedy Festival in Bangkok. He has also created the global comedy sensation Your Hood's a Joke, playing in LA, New York City, Tokyo, Toronto, Barcelona, and Amsterdam. And finally, he's the founder of Toronto Comedy All-Stars, one of Canada's premier comedy labels. Thanks so much for joining me. I want to start by touching on your, I guess, one of your shows or one of your productions, Your Hood's a Joke. Tell us a little bit of what that is, and then I'm curious, what is the funniest thing you've heard someone say about Toronto?
Sure. I mean, so Your Hood's a Joke, it's a territorial roast battle. I started it in 2013. That was around the time when like roast comedy had just started. Like the show Roast Battle also originated year. And then this was also, keep in mind, we're talking about the year 2010. This was at the peak of quote unquote cancel culture. What we call cancel culture now is what started back then. Not a big fan of the terminology, but it's the closest way I can approximate it. So essentially, we're talking about a time when I and most comedians were a lot more careful because the slightest thing could set people off. And because of just the nature of my being, I was like, you know what, let's go into the worst possible thing that could set people off. And so I started a show where we roast each other based on our history, culture, ethnicity, geography, that kind of thing. Because with the show, you can represent anybody. We could have battles between cities, like let's say Toronto versus New York. We could do countries like Canada versus USA, India versus Bangladesh. We did schools, colleges, neighborhoods, anything that you feel a strong connection to, we would pit against someone of the opposite side, right? And that's kind of how it started. And it took off pretty quickly. The controversy behind it kind of helped launch it. And one of the tricks to, like, 10 years later, we've had 0 complaints, 0 incidents. We say the absolute worst possible combination of words spoken by man on stage several times a month across the world in multiple cities. And the trick behind that has always been to approach it with equality, right? Because you're not watching somebody rag on one side. It's a back and forth. It's like watching boxing, but comedy. We have agreed that we want to watch these people go at it on their own merits, and then we decide. And on top of that, I also introduced a warning system, much like movies. You don't just walk into a movie not knowing what it's about. There's usually a rating, X, M, PG-13. So I started doing that with my comedy. So with a show like this, I would always, in all the marketing promo, even the beginning of the show, as you're walking in, we would always say, content warning, this isn't for everybody. It's probably not for you. If you don't like dark humor, get out. The rest of us want to do this in peace. And so that would, mitigate a lot of our risk where, we're not shocking somebody. We're not surprising somebody or baiting somebody into participating in something they don't want to do. So it kind of, along with Roast Battle and, other shows of this nature, we kind of became our own little circuit. And now, 10 years later, it is the biggest independent circuit in comedy in the world. There's like over a dozen cities that are part of this league with Roast Battle. And then Your Hood's a Joke, my show, has a similar presence in the same cities. We kind of circumvented the entire industry. We have our own thing going with venues, with other comedians. So that whole thing's been a whole journey. As far as the funniest thing about Toronto, I don't even know where to begin. The most common, to be honest, it depends on where the show is. When in Toronto, most of the jokes are about, how we can't afford to live, the Scarborough accent, how there's a lot of Jamaicans, things of that nature. But internationally, when we've had Toronto, let's say we've had like a Toronto versus Tokyo battle in Tokyo, the jokes tend to be about Drake or Michael Cera or other famous people from the GTA, So it's been interesting to see how people perceive, each other depending on the setting, right? And I mean, me personally, I've lived around the world, and my experience has been that people like to talk shit. So this is basically the show about talking shit to each other. It turns out it's very popular, and now it plays in multiple locations, every month, sometimes, multiple times, depending on what the situation is.
Amazing. Congratulations on all the success for that so far. What's
Thank you.
Toronto's standing, do you think, around the world as a city? So are we known to be, besides sort of like Drake and Weekend? What else do people think about Toronto?
Oh, the worst thing I've ever heard about Toronto internationally is that how it's New York light. But beyond that, Toronto has a very solid reputation as a city of immigrants, multicultural city, a city of arts. And also it benefits a lot from
Mm,
Canada's general reputation around the world that kind of bleeds in. I don't know if people really look at Toronto separate from Canada internationally, because internationally Canada is one giant big club. They don't say, oh, this person's from Toronto, Canada,
mhm.
Vancouver, Canada. They just say this person's from Canada, right? So we're kind of like get lumped in together. The nuance is gone, and that's pretty normal, I guess. That's pretty much how we see other places as well, or how anybody would. So it's the short version of that is people don't really think about Toronto too much unless they have to. Unless there's a new Drake lyric, or unless the Toronto Film Festival is happening, something of that nature, or or if one of our mayors ends up doing crack on Jimmy Kimmel or something. So
Yeah, or sleeping
surprisingly,
with a
come close,
secretary,
very close to
something as
that.
mundane as that. Yeah. So you said a couple of things in describing your hood's a joke. One of this is that back then when we had
Mm.
cancel culture. So are you saying that we're no longer in cancel culture territory? Are we beyond that? And secondly, what constitutes dark humor?
The first part, yes, I think we are beyond that because, I mean, it's a very long conversation, but to shorten it, and because that's the job of a comedian, we entered an era of correction in the 2010s, right? To correct historical injustices as fast as we possibly could. That was the intent. That you can't, like, words mean something and certain assumptions we have about each other are not right. That's how it started. And then it morphed into if you absolutely do not have the right opinion every time you open your mouth, you are the worst possible
Mm,
interpretation of those words, right? So it's a very common phrase. Every correction is an overcorrection. So, there's also that popular theory that the massive right wing wave of the 2015 2016 era was a direct reaction to overt
mhm,
leftist policing of everybody's language. I don't, to be honest, I don't entirely disagree with that. You push people far enough, people will do crazy things, as we can see right now happening around the world, right? And now, in my opinion, we're definitely way past that because if you were to look at the comment section of any joke, any risque post anywhere, there's usually one or two people now who'll use the
mhm,
classic 2014 BuzzFeed language, be like, well, if you said this, that means that, right? And then 1,000 people will go like, no, this person's clearly joking. You are just trying to
mhm,
interpret them in the worst way possible for clout. That era, that's the era we're at right now, where there's like a pushback to this extreme policing, this extreme purity test, really what it was. I don't really. I guess cancel culture it gives that phrase gives me the heebie-jeebies because it's been hijacked by I like every single time by the wrong people. Like there's another
mhm,
correction happening right now where it's overcorrecting. Now people are going back to overt racism and overt homophobia because they're like, well, because of cancel culture, I couldn't say this. Now I'm going to be just overtly bigoted to people. So now that is overcorrecting as well. So we're kind of in this constant push pull of I'm trying to do well, I'm trying to do something good, but I turn into a fascist. That's pretty much human history because I think I'm right, and I think I'm so right that I will force people to be right with me. That's kind of and there's always a reaction to that, and we're kind of in the react. We have been in the reaction phase to like leftist purity test now for a while. I found it much easier for me to do all kinds of jokes or even have all kinds of opinions or thoughts that would have been impossible in like the 2012
mhm.
to 2018 time period. So, yeah, we're
Well,
definitely
human beings have
outside
never
of
been
that right
really
now.
good with freedom, juggling freedom with responsibility. That's really the whole question here, right? We want to be free, but there is a price or there is a responsibility that comes
Mm-hmm.
with that. Because especially online in online spaces where you have influence just by being there, having a bigger mic and having algorithms on your side that you can pay for or inherit or something like that. I think there is
Mm-hmm.
that question, and left or right, power is power, and everybody hungers for it.
Yeah, power corrupts. That's basically what happened. And just to add to that, that thought is At this point, I have seen myself, people who were the biggest proponents of these purity tests from, like the mid 2010s, they're all gone. They have no longevity as from a comedy industry perspective. Those types of people whose entire job was to police other people for not being perfect. They literally don't have a career. Not because they were canceled, it's because at the end of the day, they had nothing to offer except negativity and bad faith interpretations of other people. So now that people have seen past that, that entire group, like there was an entire subgroup in the comedy industry in every city that has simply, they're off to whatever else is going on in their lives now. They were never interested in being creative. They were only interested in critiquing creatives for not being exactly the kind of creative that they wanted. So they've kind of failed their own test in that sense, I suppose. But yeah, it's an ever evolving situation. I wouldn't be surprised if the current overcorrection becomes a problem very soon, because it's not the last week. Like this is the 3rd of November that we're taping this. Just in the last week alone, I've seen a massive resurgence online in various comment sections about people using the N-word and being like, "What's wrong with it? Why can't I use it?" I'm like, we're back to that now? You're going to bring back the purists if you keep doing this. Like, we're stuck between extremists, essentially. We're just yo-yoing between one extreme to the other. And it's also, part of it is the algorithmic nature of the internet right now. We're all in our own bubbles, and the platforms we're on incentivize us to be like this because that is what boosts their revenue. The angrier you are, the more emotional you are, the more you'll use their apps, the more you'll comment, and the more ads you will see, and the more things you will click on, and the more things you will buy, and the more commissions people will make. But it all starts from conflict, like artificially, because people outside of the internet, and I do see a lot of people just by being a comedian, I'm out and about, I talk to people all the time, I'm doing shows, people want to hang out after shows. Human beings are not as angry in person as they are on the internet. It gives us the shield of anonymity, and being at home kind of lets out the feral side of us. And that makes everybody believe that, oh, this is how people are. But when you're actually face to face with the person, I've had very, very difficult conversations online and in person with the exact same human being. And it's such a massive difference. When you're actually face to face, you see each other's humanity and you don't assume the worst of the other person, and you're more likely to listen. Right. So there's a little bit of that where, I forget who said this, some famous, I think it was maybe Mike Tyson, that, the internet made people very comfortable with talking trash because you're not going to get punched in the face. Civility isn't there. And then you're just going to scroll over to the next fight anyway, instead of solving or resolving what the conflict was. It's all about, I'm going to say something, get the most likes and retweets, and I'm out of here. Right. So we're kind of in a prison of our own
technology firms, big platforms. They, by atomizing us, they also give people less information to sort of form judgments. Right. You go to a coffee shop, you don't give a shit who's got how much money, what religion they're from, what their political stance is. You're just like, I'm just here at a coffee shop with a bunch of people. I mean, I love going to coffee shops not knowing anybody. It's like to hang out there and people watch. And I'm anonymous, but also feel perfectly safe doing that. Right. And that's, to your point, that's how most people operate. But you go online, and the way these algorithms are built, it's meant to polarize and atomize. Right. In this time, I'm always curious. Like, for me, my greatest comic heroes are like Mitch Hedberg, Bill Hicks, for example, George Carlin. Truth tellers, hilarious, but truth tellers. I'm curious, like, how do you see the place of arts and comedy in this particular time? I don't mean like every joke has to have it has to peel off the layers of complex social narratives and stuff like that. It can just be funny and hilarious. In a world where we have increasingly prescriptive political doctrines, prescriptive technologies, what role does art and comedy play in creating maybe a more nuanced language?
A huge role. I personally love it because it's made comedy more dangerous. For a while, it was getting boring. Like, oh, I can just say whatever and it's fine. Then came the purists, and I'm like, oh crap, this isn't fine. Now it's too dangerous. I've literally been like at the height of it in like the early to mid 2010s, had been banned from like several online spaces for jokes that actually were clean enough to air on the CBC. The CBC aired some jokes that a couple of people were like, they literally took the worst possible interpretation. I'll actually tell you what it was. I used a certain phrase. The phrase was slaying mad pussy. Does that sound wrong to you? It's just Yeah, well, I got banned from like 12 different places because it promotes
Ooh.
violence against women, that language, because I use the word slay. Slaying mad pussy. It was a pun. That joke was a pun about a guy who puts down mentally ill cats. He's slaying mad pussy all day. That was the whole joke. And I got banned from so many places because you know how it is. Somebody hears a joke, they turn it into a meme, it got shared, and then people are like, wait, this guy's in our group, and he's using violence or using language that implies violence, blah, blah, blah. Boom, 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 ban, 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 ban. So stuff like that was a little too much, but there's still an undercurrent of danger that I like to play against. I would argue most artists need something to push back against. Otherwise, it's boring. Otherwise, you're just kind of, at least the way I do things, you're probably just sitting there going, well, the trees look nice. Like, I'm not a poet. I'm not here to talk about nice things. I'm here, as most comedians are, to reflect back the unspoken nature of what's happening. Like the funniest jokes are ones where you're like, yeah,
Right.
exactly. You're relating to it. You're sitting there going, yeah, exactly. But nobody ever said that. Nobody took that thought and crystallized it because we're just living through it. It's like the two fish in the ocean. One fish goes, hey man, the water's nice. And the other fish goes, what the hell is water? So you're not aware of these things because you're constantly surrounded by it. So for an era that we're living through right now, there's constant bombardment from every side. There's conflict, there's anger, there's surveillance, there's just no escape from doom scrolling and the constant march to an apocalyptic end. We've got double tornadoes, fires where there shouldn't be, snow where there shouldn't be, floods where there shouldn't be. People need, I guess, not to toot artists' horns too much, but art is what is used to cope with that, to find a way to synthesize it into something coherent that you can now be like, yeah, this is how I feel. I haven't been able to put it into words, but this is what's going on because so much is going on. I'm too overwhelmed. So that's the role of artists and comedians in general, in my opinion, is to like bring or speak into
Exactly.
life
And I
what
find,
has not been spoken.
comedy is that rare form which not only allows you to point the finger from outside to inside to yourself and go like, oh, maybe I'm also like this, or I'm also participating in this problem. Not only that, and at the same time feeling safe to laugh at yourself and with others, but it's also the thing that gives you a sense of agency, to your point, right? From giving the unspoken, the thing that you cannot describe, that feels arbitrary, that is imposed, to something goes like, oh, okay, I kind of understand it more now. Maybe that's why.
Yeah, because a lot of these problems that we face are presented as, oh, this incredibly complicated thing that you couldn't possibly solve. Well, that's a comedian's job, is to distill it into, well, no, at its heart, it's this very small thing that has ballooned into this large thing. So a lot of it is also, pretty much pointing out the simple nature of complicated things. It helps people deal with this. Like, oh, well, what can we do? We're just helpless in the face of climate change and state power and unchecked corporate surveillance, et cetera, et cetera. That's where somebody comes in and be like, well, it's actually 1, 2, and 3. There's like 13 people who are in charge of all of it, and here's their addresses. I mean, not that I would recommend that, but that's generally the idea. It's like, no, it's not. Right. We're not as helpless. We're just being,
and that's how the powers that be win, right?
So
I want to switch gears a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
And talk about your formative years and how you grew up. But I want to take it from the perspective of 2 online monikers that you've had, right? And maybe you still have. Yeah. One is the Brown Russian.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And the other is your IG handle, Terror Suspect. So tell me a little bit about where those came from, and then how did you grow up? Where did you grow up? I know you're as a diaspora Bangladeshi. You've grown up in Russia and Bangladesh. Tell me a little bit about how you identify and where they come from.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was born and raised in the Soviet Union. I have no accent in Russian when I speak, which freaks out Russian people. But I also, because I left when I was 10 years old, because the country was collapsing, I sound like a 10-year-old child when I try to speak. There's that. Calling myself the Brown Russians because that's just what I heard a lot growing up. People, there's no brown Russians. I'm like, well, you want to see my birth certificate? I'm not an American president, but I can find you a birth certificate. So that's that. It was just a straight up reflection of what I was lived through. And my handles, most of my handles on the internet are Terror Suspect because post 9/11, that was imposed upon me. It's not like I had a choice, and I thought it was funny because, well, these people can't tell the difference between Arabs and South Asians, right? I'm like, South Asian people didn't attack the Twin Towers, but every single one of us, especially young males, became a target for surveillance, for harassment, for all kinds of things, right? So that was just simply another version of me reflecting back
Mm-hmm.
what I experienced, right? It was simply the truth, still is to a degree. And then growing up, around, I mean, we bounced around a lot, Russia to India to Bangladesh to here and a whole bunch of other places in between, always for pretty much bad reasons. Country collapsed, domestic violence, running away from domestic violence, that kind of a thing. So it was always we are quite literally a family of runaways. We had to pick up and leave every single time, depending on the circumstances. So that experiences like that, if they don't absolutely shatter you, they can make you very. I don't react normally to things just because of my upbringing. Like my reaction, for example, to the pandemic was, no, okay, cool. I know what this is like. People here are about to find out. People here are about to find out how the rest of the world lives. Like I don't know if you spent a time in Bangladesh when the dengue fever was going around. Do you remember that? Yeah, I'm like, it's my third pandemic at this point. It's just, except in that part of the world, you just have to live life exactly the same way while people around you are dying off. Whereas when the pandemic hit globally, especially in countries that are unaccustomed to mass catastrophe, and that was, to me, low-key funny. I was just like, dude, you want to go build houses in places where they live like this, and you can't even handle the safest version of what happens.
Yeah, it's like you get to watch TV and have groceries delivered to you while you live through a pandemic.
Exactly. I was just sitting there going, this stuff is gonna expose a lot of people. Like the level to which we can work from home, the government is giving us money. Like at the same time that we were going through that here in India, there was a massive oxygen shortage, right? Because you can't, in South Asia, there's no social distancing at the best of times. There's 1 million people per square kilometer stacked on top of each other, right? The poorer the neighborhood, the denser it is. Even the rich neighborhoods are dense as hell. And they ran out of oxygen. My biological father, who still lives there, who we ran away from because of the aforementioned domestic violence in India. In India, he's Indian. I'm half Indian. My mom is Bangladeshi. So he caught COVID, and I haven't spoken to this guy in like 18 years. His wife, my technical stepmom, calls me out of nowhere. She's like, we need you to buy oxygen for this man who would beat you and your family, which is what I had to do because, well, just out of obligation. Also, it's like a family thing. I have a younger brother who has a different relationship with him. I did it for his sake. At the same time, I was hearing people complain about, well, I gotta go to Starbucks wearing a mask, and they have to have a barrier, and this is like communist China right now. I'm like, well, do you wanna deal with not having oxygen, because that's the alternative? Do you wanna pick between everybody above the age of 60 dying and then you having to delay every other procedure because there's no hospital resources left, or hear me out, put on a mask and stay home because the government is paying you? So there's like, to live in both sides, because at the same time, like, we ended up spending about 5,000 Canadian to get oxygen, black market oxygen, by the way. Because what happened in India was so many people were hospitalized with COVID. Like, one of the things that COVID does is you cannot breathe. Your lungs and blood will literally not accept the oxygen coming in from your nose. There's nothing blocking you, but you're suffocating while you stand there. That's what happens. So you have to be filled, like you have to be connected to a oxygen mask. And so many hundreds of millions of people needed those masks that they ran out of oxygen in India. And not that they ran out. You know how it is in South Asia. There's a lot of corruption. So the oxygen makers or whatever, they were like, well, everything costs exactly 10,000 times more. And that's where, like I said, my stepmother calls me. He's like, yep, I know you haven't spoken to us in almost 20 years, but he is dying. You got to give us some money to do it. And so I did. So that's what I mean about the difference in experience between people in the global north versus the global south, and for once being united in this very, very specific black swan pandemic event, which, by the way, was self-inflicted on so many levels. Like, the funniest part of that for me is, this is not to be conspiratorial, my opinion, it's a man-made virus. Yeah, it's a man-made virus, according to the CIA, according to multiple government agencies, including the U.S. Senate. Most, like the vast majority of what we would call respectable institutions are now saying, look, man, scientifically speaking, it's impossible for an organism to evolve this quickly in this amount of time unless there was, there was some intervention. And also, not to state the obvious, but we got a coronavirus coming out of a place called the coronavirus lab. I'm just gonna say that. I don't want to
It's a
talk
conspiracy.
down to
Don't say
people,
that.
but
Yeah.
if you get syphilis and you just came back from spring break, you know, you can't blame a bat or a monkey. It's like, what a coincidence that a novel coronavirus came out of the same region that has the world's largest novel coronavirus research. Oh no.
Right.
Wonder what the big mystery is. So there's that. And the fact that it happened right around the same time that the US government shut down pandemic centers, right? This was a Donald Trump decision that why do we need pandemic centers? And the whole point of these centers was there were all these places around the world that would monitor the chance of another pandemic coming. And the moment they saw signs, they would take action to cut it out at the source. They took those away. People kept experimenting. And now we're in this situation, man-made, trying to blame the Chinese for having bad diets. That was our thing. Oh, no, they eat bat soup over there, those crazy people.
Or going like, oh, you know what? It was a chicken sitting on top of a rat, on top of a pangolin, and one shat on the other, and the shit just trickled onto the lowest animal, and obviously it jumped into humans. Great. That's a great theory.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, those open air fish markets, those people they like to eat.
How can I be racist without being racist?
We would never eat, and that's clear. and exactly. It was the whole thing was, to me, it was hilarious, and I say that as someone who's had direct family members die from COVID. Like my actual grandmother passed away from COVID. She was also quite old, so there's that. But it's not to say that it didn't happen. There was a virus, there is a virus still, and there was a pandemic. But the cause of it is where I'm like, this is starting to sound real funny.
Talk to me a little bit about the sort of personal journey you've had through that. Like, I also lost family members, and I happened to be in Calgary. It was my own choice to move there at that time because I wanted that experience of being somewhere new and being closer to nature, but also a very difficult experience, particularly if you lost family in Bangladesh and I couldn't travel back to keep my other family members safe.
Yeah.
And having lost my uncle, who was like a patriarch in the family, it was both a very dark time, but also, it was a transformational moment for many reasons. I'm wondering, what was the time for you, both personally as a human being, having that experience as an artist, but also to your point, I'm curious about you've talked about how your family left from place to place to escape abuse. And then here you had to step up to preserve the life of your father, biological father, who was the source of abuse. What was that experience like? And what's your relationship with him now?
Oh, I gave him the money. I haven't spoken to him since. That's my relationship. I'm pretty, like I said, I don't react appropriately to things. It's impossible for me because, you grow up with trauma after trauma. There's a part of you that's like, finds a way to deal with it, and there's only so many times you can be like, oh, I'm so sad. After a while, it's like, just fuck off. What do I have to deal with now? A lot of the things that people experienced during the pandemic, I experienced by age 9. So for me, this is really old news. Tragedy and like trauma is boring to me, quite boring, especially when it happens to me. I'm like, all right, bring it. It's kind of like that. So as far as, the whole thing about having to save the life of basically the abuser of the family, to me, it was like, well, okay, crazy things happen. That was probably the smallest thing that I like emotionally that worried me. Mostly it was being disappointed by people. That's what the pandemic was like. They were like, wow, you guys you just don't care about anybody, and what was surprising is how little it took for people to completely turn on each other, to lose their sense of compassion. It's like, oh no, I'm slightly inconvenienced. Well, I guess Asian people suck. That it went straight to racism for a lot of people. So on a personal level, I having grown up in much worse circumstances than having to stay at home with my Xbox and free government money, this was nothing on that note. On a professional level, it helped me a lot because, quite honestly, this happened across every industry that I know of, but I'm just going to use comedy as an example, is that there was a massive culling. There's a lot of people in every industry that are just there for some other tangential reason, right? They're there as a job. And I'm not talking about like jobs. I'm talking about industries where you choose to participate. And that is any kind of creative industry, anything where you're like, I'm doing this because I love it, right? It could be any kind of people who like to build things will probably say the same thing to you or have a similar experience where there was a massive culling amongst people who didn't really do comedy because they like the art of it. It was mostly a social thing. Comedy attracts a lot of mentally ill people who are incapable of being anywhere else. So for a lot of those people, it's like, oh, if I can tell 2 or 3 jokes on stage, I can have friends, other comedians. So it was literally a social life for people who hadn't written a new joke in 10 years, but because they had a couple jokes, they had the right to hang out with everybody else. So that whole segment got wiped out because they didn't really feel the absence of comedy the way some of us did. We're like, no, we really want to do this. We got to find a way to do this. So in my case, I started doing shows.
I went to one of those shows. It was fucking awesome.
Like once a week. Yeah, exactly. We were socially distanced. People wore masks, and we were just trying to have a human connection. Right? There were people who tried to put on shows in barber shops, in parks, outdoor parks, whatever it is we could do. We tried. And the people who weren't in it for the love of the game, they either quit or they moved to another city. A lot of people straight up moved back home. Like the economics of our society weren't working for us anymore. So you can't really blame them for that. So the pandemic experience for me was all of a sudden there were fewer people in my industry, but we were all like true believers. We're in it because we love this. The quality of every show spiked upwards so hard because there were no more fillers. There were no more hanger-ons. There were no more social climbers. It was just pure comedians. So instantly, the quality of the industry went up. And one thing that happened that we talked about before is that from the audience's perspective, post-pandemic, having gone through like such a traumatic event, and now in an era of hyperinflation, people just don't have the patience for bad product. Or mediocre product even. Nobody has time to just, it's Tuesday night, I'm just going to go to a bar and then watch this open mic and maybe waste a couple hours of my time. There's no time or money to waste anymore. And I happen to live in the comedy world. I live in a very specific segment where I put on premium shows. They're at big venues, there's production value, and the tickets cost a little bit more. And what the biggest bane of my existence pre-pandemic was being undercut by mediocre shows that would cost less, and then the venues would go, well, I can pay this person less. I don't care if they bring in fewer people. Post-pandemic, no venue can afford to have an empty seat on any night. So people like myself and other producers who are known for bringing in an audience every time, even if it cost the venue more, they were okay with doing it because they understood that they can't afford to have an off night anymore. So all of a sudden, there was a culling and there was a concentration of work amongst pretty much, I would say, the top 10%. And then now we're kind of seeing like a resurgence, like a little bit of, I guess, nature is healing. There's more newcomers coming back into the fold, and we're kind of seeing a little bit of the old style of doing things, but not it's never going to go back to that because from the audience's perspective, there's just no appetite for fucking around. If you're not good at it, people do not have the patience for you anymore. So, there's been a real hardening. And there's been kind of, to my ear, to my eyes.
Do you feel like that's happened because, obviously inflation, everything costing more, people losing their jobs and stuff is part of this. But do you feel like post-pandemic, people have an innate sense of why art is important, why being in community is important, why experiencing music and live performance in person is important?
Yeah, I think what really happened is people stopped taking things for granted out here. I think there's a lot more respect for time and your life now. Having gone through something that was life-threatening. A lot of people in the global north have not gone through anything like that. There's like that sense of complacency that, I'll just do it tomorrow. It's gone. Everybody's on survival mode the way the rest of the world operates. The rest of the world knows that tomorrow isn't promised. And I think the global north knows that as well. If tomorrow isn't promised, you're not going to waste your time. You're not going to waste your time. You're not going to waste your energy. You're not going to waste your money. You're going to do things that feel good to you with the people you want to be with. and you're not going to waste time on people who don't have your back, fake friends, bad nights out, poor quality food. The level,
It's interesting
there's
you
no
say that
patience for
because,
that
you
anymore,
started
essentially.
describing the pandemic as like you spent a lot of time being disappointed in people. But this sounds like a good outcome, right? People are
Yeah,
genuinely more kind,
it
perhaps,
is
to
a good outcome.
themselves and to people around them because, to your point,
Mhm.
their tomorrow is not promised. You can't take any of the shit with you, right?
Yeah,
I want to
yeah.
position comedy and perhaps art, speaking as not a comedian but as an artist in some way, is that there is this part where art becomes performance when you're skilled, right? Where you're the master of your craft, and then there's the art part of the art that is therapeutic. Generally, it gives you something. It's a tool to look inwards. From that perspective, tell me about
Mm.
how and why psychedelics are important. Mushrooms, cannabis, all plant medicines are important, or what role do they play in your life, both in terms of therapy as well as enhancing your performance?
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I'm sober on stage. I'm not one of those people. Like I used to maybe smoke a joint and go on stage, but over time I've realized I'm way better when I'm sober on stage. I use mushrooms and cannabis to pretty much to self-medicate because I have a
Mm,
pathological distrust of pills. It's not. I think it's a like, how do I say it? It's a personal thing. I don't distrust them. It's just I don't like to
mm,
change my body chemistry from something made in a lab. If I have a headache, I'd rather smoke an indica than take Tylenol. I still
mhm.
think people should be on medication if they need it. I just personally have an aversion because I'm a weirdo. I'm not a science denier. I think science rocks. And I think medical science in particular, like I'm brown, I have a lot of doctors in my family. I believe in
Mhm.
doctors and the kind of people who choose to be doctors. I just don't like stuff in my blood that didn't grow out of the
Defaulting to pill
ground.
popping,
That's
you
just
mean?
me.
Like defaulting to
So
that kind
in,
of
in
like,
my
yeah.
particular case,
Mhm.
yeah, I'd rather try to figure it out. Like I know that changes with age. I'm 38, at the moment. So if you're, I'm not super old, but I'm not super young either. But at some, there's a point to which there's a certain point at which you can still depend on your body to fix things. But there comes a point where now, okay, now you
Right.
need intervention from medical science, pills, etc. I'll probably get to that point. I will get to that point at some point. We'll cross that bridge, and I won't have any
Mhm.
problems taking medication then. I'm just trying to avoid it as much as I can. Like, for example, I very obviously have ADD, ADHD, whatever you want to call it, and instead of being on
Mhm.
medication for it, I'll smoke
Mhm.
weed to help me focus. It helps me to relax. It helps me when I'm completely sober, I'll do 15 different things and not finish a single one. If I smoke, I can focus on like three of those things, and get them done. I've heard of like ADD medication, how it's helped a lot of comedians, etc. I've just been avoiding it myself. Who knows? Maybe one day I'll be on it. Not so far. Mushrooms help me sort of clear like the not years, but like weeks of mental
Mhm.
trash that accumulates in your mind. That's what ends up happening. Like you might be going about your day. Maybe somebody bumped you into you, or somebody worded something the wrong way, and you got mad about it, but then you didn't do anything, but it's still in the back of your head. And as you live your life, all these little annoyances, they accumulate without you
Mhm.
knowing, creating a burden on your mental health. So I find that when I do mushrooms, it's like a concentrated form of therapy because suddenly I am forced to deal with all these things that I didn't even realize I was dealing with. Like I didn't realize I was still mad about this guy who charged me $20 extra for weed at the dispensary by accident. Like it's not his fault. He was stoned and I was too stoned to even correct him. I'm like, okay, I guess I'll pay $140 for a quarter. you know? And then I was mad about it for like 20 minutes, but then I forgot. I'm like, yeah, whatever. I'll
Mhm.
just but then that's still in the back of my head. It's still, poking and prodding. So mushrooms help me clear out that the
Mhm.
detritus, the trash that is accumulated. And I guess that is essentially therapy, vocalizing what you didn't vocalize and want to vocalize and want to face. And I always come out much more
Mhm.
clear-headed,
Mhm.
unburdened as well. Because, I've heard this a lot. You do mushrooms and you end up crying because, oh no, I was so mean to my mom when I was 12. All
Right.
these things just start bubbling up to the surface. So that's kind of I use mushrooms to
Mhm.
rejuvenate
Is
my
there any
my
particular
consciousness
experience
essentially.
that stands out as the most meaningful?
Oh, I've had a few. I've had a few. I'll tell you one, which was some would consider it a bad trip because when I'm on mushrooms, I'll just, I'll sit on my balcony and I'll
Ooh.
just stare at the view and be lost in my thoughts and, unpack things that need to be unpacked, that kind of a thing. If somebody were to see me on mushrooms, they would just see a guy sitting there for 8 hours straight, a single tear rolling down his cheek like that, remembering something wrong or some injustice I committed, that sort of a thing. But the most interesting and memorable trip I had, because I was hanging out on my balcony, and what I do before I do mushrooms is I try to load up my brain with whatever I want to think about, right? Like it's intentional. Maybe I want to think about X, Y, Z, so I'll read on it, or I'll focus on it, and then I'll eat the mushrooms. And this particular instance, I was watching some stuff about reality, about quantum physics, and I'm like trying to decode what really is or isn't. The universe, etc. Very cliche stoner mushroom behavior, right? So I was reading upon all. I'm like, let's do some mushrooms and synthesize all the data that I've absorbed and see what I get, right? So I'm on my balcony, and trigger warning for unaliving type of conversation. So I'm on my balcony, I'm just looking out, and I'm thinking like, the only way you will find out what reality is after you die. That's the only way. That's literally, unless we make some machine that can cross dimensions or whatever. With technology as it is right now, I guess I'll find out. My thought was, I guess I'll find out when I die, right? As I'm thinking this, I literally had an auditory hallucination where I heard voices from outside. One guy goes, yourself, right? And I literally, I'm like, what? And then I hear the same voice, other shoulder, just kill yourself. You'll find out. And my first reaction was, don't tell me what to do. You don't need a rant here. I'm just talking to myself at this point. I'm full on schizo at this point. And so I'm like, all right, I'm on mushrooms. I'm thinking about the nature of reality and how you'll find it out when you're dead. So that's what's happening. I was lucid enough to be like, you know what? Let's just walk away from the balcony. Let's go sit in my living room, pet my dog who's just hanging out there till the high passes on. So as that happened, I realized, this is what people mean by, like being like what's the word? There's a term for when you go full something on psychedelics. When reality doesn't seem real anymore. It's escaping me right now, because at that point I was like really into how we connect to each other and what it means to be real, and is this table here or not? And I'm hearing voices that to me seem like they're coming outside of my body. Like I said before, I think before we recorded, I don't really do a big dosage of shrooms. I'll do maybe a gram and a half, where you're still functional. I like on that dosage, I've gone out, done groceries, I've just been very distracted by lights. Okay. I've done shows. Yeah. I mean, one time with an ex, we did about a gram and a half, and then we went to brunch, and we were giggling so like it was like school children. We just sat there with our eggs going, this used to be a living thing. Just like we're eating an egg. Just dumb things like that. But generally speaking, that was probably, I guess, the only time where I've had like an experience where like, wow, this is interesting. But most of the time, it's been very therapeutic in a more basic way, where I'm simply confronting things that I push to the back of my mind, right? So, and that happens all the time. I don't know if that's what you meant by something poignant, but like I've always been able to answer questions that I haven't been able to answer sober, but on mushrooms. Because they open up my mind to possibilities I've blocked myself away from, right? Like you have, I guess, what is called conditioning, right? We go through our lives and we pick up all these habits, these rules, these conventions, and we live our lives in accordance to that without even knowing. And I find that when I'm on mushrooms, all my conditioning goes away. Suddenly, everything looks new, as if I'm looking at it for the first time. You're back to the beginner mindset. Because by the time you get through a game, through a career, or whatever, you've picked up all these habits and you've gotten good at it, but you've also you end up in a specialization. And I find that mushrooms break open those shackles, and suddenly you're back to the beginning. You're like, yeah, why do I do that? Why am I like this? Why did I think that this is how it has to be? And that is an ongoing thing. And I think for me, that's the most important and the most attractive part of doing mushrooms. Is that it opens up my mind to possibilities that were always there, but I didn't see because I created
it reverts to the childlike state where you ask the basic questions, the hardest questions, but the basic questions, right? And you're not jaded by the sort of layers and, and the bullshit that comes with just getting old and living and stuff like that. What role would you say mushrooms or psychedelics have played in keeping you hopeful? And I say this with George Carlin had this saying, right? Inside every cynic lived a disappointed idealist. But Bill Hicks, George Carlin were still out, I think, ultimately very hopeful people because they talked about compassion a lot. It was about being better people, a better culture. Yeah, sometimes it came out as misanthropic and stuff like that, but that's the delivery. That's their style. But like, how do you remain hopeful?
It's performance. Oh, that's.
I mean, you strike me as somebody's hopeful person, even though you claim you're
I'm not hopeful. I guess that is one interpretation because I pathologically look at the. People would say I look at the bright side of things. I look at the side of things I can influence. That's how I look at it, because to use comedy as an example, there are times when you do a show because it is creatively fulfilling and you are on stage expressing yourself the way you want to. And there are times you get hired to do a show to use your skills in a particular way that the client wants, right? So those are called road gigs. They are tedious as hell. You're in a Boston Pizza because Boston Pizza wanted to have an employee appreciation party. Nobody's looking at you. They're eating their dinner. The lights are on. You're literally just background noise, right? And a lot of people hate that. A lot of comedians hate that kind of a show because it is tedious. I look at it as there's like 2 extra zeros in my paycheck because Boston Pizza has money. The creatively fulfilling shows are usually single-digit paying. You're getting a coffee, but you get to fully express yourself. And in either case, you can do one of 2 things. You can either focus on the negative side of it, or you can focus on the reason why you're there. So I always focus on, well, I don't want to do the show as a creative person, but as a rent-paying person, this is the best day of my life. By doing this absolutely horrendous, unfulfilling hour and a half in front of 20 people who are at a work event and would rather be at home playing League of Legends is fine by me because at the end of the day, this means I just made my entire month's
And I really
rent
like this
in 20
perspective
minutes.
because, you
So
said this in an interview that I'd read. It's a very practical approach that actually would allow more artists to be artists. If they just accept that you don't have to be a fucking starving artist.
Yeah.
Paying your bills and not having to worry about it is a good thing.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. It's very hard to be creative when you're worried about rent, when you're worried about whether you can eat, right? So that peace of mind it makes or breaks people. If you're literally starving, you're not going to be funny. You're not going to be creative. You're just going to be hungry, right? So my approach just with everything is I know not to beat my head against the wall because I grew up with that. I grew up with like circumstances that are impossible for a child to break out of. So I have a lifetime of accumulated habits of how can I make the best of this in these circumstances, right? So that's kind of how it is. Our circumstances on the planet right now are bleak, So it's not that I'm hopeful. It's more like I'm pretty confident that I'll find a way out and that most people will find a way out, I just don't think the world will be what it was. And if that's how it has to be, that's how it has to be. You just kind of, it's a cliche, but you have to accept the things you cannot change. Otherwise, you'll go crazy. You'll go crazy thinking, why doesn't this happen? Shut up. Think about how you can move through this, how you can make something out of it, how you can deflect, construct, whatever it is. You have to figure out how you can move with something that will absolutely not change. That's if it's hope, so be it. For me, it's more, it's I guess, not even pragmatism. It's just how my brain is
very
wired
Buddhist too, right?
From my
You act on the things you can change, right? And I think when I say hope, to me at least, I don't mean like hope of a better world in the sort of like the Disney cliche sense. I mean hopeful in the sense that human beings are creative and we might be on this arc of history where we perish, just like the fucking dinosaurs, just like every other civilization, because we haven't learned, because we have a collective amnesia as a culture. But what gives me hope is that human beings, when we connect through art, through experiences, through sharing experiences, we are inherently better, stronger people. I'm hopeful about the resilience of cultures, of communities.
Yeah. Yeah, resilience is the right word here because, if you've been in Bangladesh and other parts of the world, like I have had the poor experience in every other country, and to be poor in one of the poorest countries on earth, that's a very, very unique thing. And even while living in like a really bad part of Dhaka, really, I saw how resilient people are in circumstances that when I try not to tell people because it bums them out, it straight up bums people out when I tell people about my childhood. Because for example, I've been doing this bit about how I'm the bummer friend because every time you ask me something, the reason behind it is so sad, right? Because I'm 38. I
I
learned
still
how to
don't know how to
swim
swim.
last
So
year
you're better than I.
at the age of 37. It's the
I
easiest
don't
thing on
believe
the
that for a
planet,
second,
apparently.
man.
It's,
But good for you.
I'll show you. Oh, see, I didn't either. But the thought that changed me was even a baby can swim. So there's obviously a relationship between water and the human body that works. That's kind of the thing I went in with. And when I tell people, yeah, I just learned to swim, and they're like, wow, that's so cool. It's good to pick up a new skill later in life. And why didn't you? My answer is always, well, because I barely had clean drinking water as a kid, much less something to swim in. Because they're expecting something like, oh, you were just probably hydro. I'm like, no, I love water. It's just I was poor. We had parasites in our drinking water. We didn't have water to splash around in. We barely had water to drink. So, when you come from those circumstances and you see how people still overcome that, I grew up in very tough situations where everybody around me was still a human being about it. They were struggling, but there was still, there was family, there's friendships, there's love, there's all of that. So knowing that baseline about humanity makes it very easy for me to navigate whatever's going on around. I'm like, because my answer is always like, trust me, you'll be fine. You don't know how strong you are. You will find.
So you're a hopeful person.
I know because I've seen it. Sure. I think it's just anthropology. I just know.
Last question. So we've gone through quite a journey here. As a diaspora Bangladeshi, as a successful, seasoned artist, comic, somebody who is very active in Toronto, you have things that you build globally. What advice would you give to aspiring artists, Bangladeshis like us? There's lots of Bangladeshis I find in the diaspora that are afraid of walking the unconventional path, and I understand that. It comes from a collective trauma of not having security and safety and generational wealth and so on. What advice do you have for anyone who wants to pursue the arts or comedy?
Don't do it. It's a tough life. I don't want the competition, but if you are going to do it, do what makes you happy. And I know that sounds cliche, but it's true for a reason. The arts, comedy in particular, is not easy. You can make a lot more money with 10% of the effort elsewhere. So if you're doing this, don't make it tedious for yourself. A lot of people end up trying to copy other trends, styles. They wake up in the morning, they're like, oh, I got to, so-and-so posted this and got 12 million views. I have to do that thing. If you do that, you're going to be miserable. So if you're in any form of art, if you don't do it for yourself, the tedium of it and the difficulty of it will be unsurmountable because you don't enjoy it. If you don't enjoy something and you want to get paid for it, there's a day job for that. Just go do that. But if you're going to go get into the arts, make sure to, whatever the art is, whatever your process is, that it gives you joy, because that'll be the only thing motivating you to get better at it, right? Like just the way, like to use a gaming example, I'm a huge gamer. I play the games I like and I'm good at those games, and I don't play the games I don't like. It's simple as that, because I have a choice here. I don't play turn-based games. I know Baldur's Gate 3 is huge right now. Personally, not a huge fan of turn-based combat. I prefer real time. I prefer games that are toxic as hell. I don't like agreeable Stardew Valley type The Sims 4 or whatever. Like, I need drama. I need toxicity. I need people to be calling each other slurs on the mic. So that's what I do because I enjoy it and I'll spend a lot of time on it. Same with any kind of art. Do the thing that you enjoy, because you will need that to motivate you to the absolute hell you have walked into, because it is not for the weak of heart.
Amazing.
It really is.
Thank you. Very practical advice. Appreciate it. Danish, thanks so much. I really appreciate you spending all this time and really going through your journey. I think it's super inspiring. And again, as a fellow Bangladeshi, it really, I think it's very inspiring to see someone on the global stage doing the thing that you're coming from, the life that you've lived. So I appreciate it.
No, thank you. I appreciate you having me. I'm like I said, I'm gonna right after this, I'm gonna go get me some
You
mushrooms.
also seem to be buying drugs like people bought drugs
see
in
what
the
happens
90s.
this weekend.
You don't have to do those things anymore.
Yeah. I don't like that it's legal. That's just my
You need some
pathological
drama.
anti-authoritarian, contrarian thing where I'm like, I need it. This is the only thing I understand. And I'm sorry to bring up this man's name. Elon Musk is the only thing I understand about him. The guy is obviously out of his mind. But the only thing I can relate to is he loves drama. The only reason he bought Twitter is because Tesla and SpaceX are doing so well, they don't need him anymore. And he needs to fight something. Guy's a moron. Guy's the worst businessman I've ever seen in my life. But holy crap, do I relate to this guy wanting to blow everything up just so he has something to do in the morning. I get it. I need to buy my drugs where there's an element of danger. I just can't. I can't walk into a place and it's all brightly lit and there's a receipt. What? What are we doing here? Half
A
the
very
fun is
unconventional
breaking the
ending,
law.
talking
Come
about
on.
buying mushrooms and Elon Musk being a terrible businessman. Thanks, Danish. Appreciate it, man.
Sweet. Thanks a lot.
This podcast was brought to life with the help of Carolyn Tripp on art and design. Thanks so much for listening to Minority Trip Report. If you're learning from or enjoying the podcast, please subscribe to MTR on YouTube at Minority Trip Report and follow us on Instagram at Minority Trip. It's a zero-cost way to support us and help us spread the word. Please also sign up with your email for new episode announcements, events, as well as our forthcoming newsletter. I'm your host, Raad Seraj. See you next time.